Two people experience the same trauma: childhood abuse, devastating betrayal, catastrophic loss. One emerges destroyed, bitter, perpetually trapped in the past. The wound never heals. The other emerges transformed, stronger, with a crystal-clear purpose. The wound becomes a scar that tells a story of overcoming. Same events, opposite results. The difference isn't in what happened, it's in something microscopic, almost invisible, that occurs in the space between the trauma and the response to the trauma. This space, this crack where our humanity lives, was mapped by a man who went through literal hell and returned not with hatred, but with a map. Viktor Frankl was a Viennese psychiatrist when he was deported to Auschwitz in 1942. Between 1942 and 1945, he was held in 4 Nazi concentration camps. He lost his wife, his father, his mother, and his brother. He was reduced to a number tattooed on his arm. He worked in freezing cold, extreme hunger, disease, and constant violence. But Frankl was not just a prisoner, he was an observer, a scientist of his own agony. And he saw something that academic psychology could never have predicted. It wasn't the severity of the suffering that determined who survived. Some men in better conditions gave up first. Others, in the worst conditions, resisted with unwavering strength. The hidden variable? Meaning. From this observation, logotherapy was born, the therapy of meaning. The revolutionary idea that human beings are not primarily driven by the pursuit of pleasure or power, but by the search for meaning. What you are about to discover is not abstract philosophy. These are principles extracted from the most cruel laboratory humanity has ever created. They are psychological laws tested under conditions where falsehood kills and only essential truth survives. Throughout this video, we will decipher the psychological survival manual that Viktor Frankl wrote with his own flesh and blood. And you will understand how to extract meaning from any trauma, transforming your pain into purpose, your suffering into strength, your scars into wisdom. Because the question was never if you will suffer. The question is, will you let suffering destroy you, or will you use it to build something transcendent?
The last of human freedoms. Everything can be taken from a man except one thing, the last of the human freedoms: to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. The Nazis controlled everything in the camps: what the prisoners ate, when they slept, whether they lived or died. They even controlled their right to use the bathroom, to look a guard in the eye, to exist as a human being. But there was one fortress that no SS guard could breach: the inner fortress of the human mind. Frankl realized something that contradicts all modern determinism, that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. This discovery is revolutionary because it destroys the victimhood narrative of modernity. It doesn't matter what they did to you. It doesn't matter what trauma you carry. You still possess the fundamental choice how to interpret and respond to what happened. Frankl describes digging a trench, extremely hungry with frozen feet, and being beaten by a foreman. Physically, he was completely subdued. But mentally, he began to imagine himself in the future, in a warm, brightly lit conference room, giving a lecture on the psychology of concentration camps. He transformed his present suffering into material for scientific observation. He became a researcher of his own torture. This choice of attitude saved him. It gave him a purpose that transcended the moment. It made him not a passive victim, but an active observer. Consider modern trauma: emotional abuse, betrayal, bankruptcy, illness, loss. Most people treat these events as definitive sentences of their identities. I am an abused person. I am someone who was betrayed. I am a failure. But Frankl shows us that we can choose another narrative. I am someone who went through abuse and emerged stronger. I am someone who learned about human nature through betrayal. I am someone who was tested by failure and discovered resilience. The arsenal. Practical application. Exercise of inner distance. When faced with a painful situation, practice observing it as a scientist would observe a phenomenon. Not, "This is destroying me," but "This is interesting. How does my mind react to extreme stress? What can I learn?" Future narrative technique. Imagine yourself in the future telling this story as a lesson learned. Which version of yourself will you be telling? The defeated victim or the transformed hero? Suffering without meaning is despair. In a way, suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. Here is the fundamental equation that Frankl discovered. Despair equals suffering minus meaning. It's not the amount of pain that determines whether you collapse, it's the absence of a reason to endure that pain. Frankl observed men in the same brutal conditions. Some gave up quickly, others resisted indefinitely. The difference wasn't in their physique, it was in their purpose. Those who had a why to live could endure any how. Those who lost their purpose, even if physically stronger, collapsed psychologically first, and physical death followed soon after. This is the truth that Nietzsche captured perfectly. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Frankl tells of a fellow prisoner who had a dream. He would be released on March 31st. That date became his reason for living. He resisted because he had a date, a concrete temporal meaning. When March 31st arrived and liberation did not come, he collapsed. He fell ill with typhus on April 1st and died on April 2nd. The loss of meaning killed him faster than the disease.
If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support.
On the other hand, Frankl describes men who maintained meaning through completing intellectual work, reuniting with a child, witnessing horror. These men developed almost supernatural resilience. How many people today suffer not from the objective severity of their problems, but from the lack of meaning in their suffering? Modern depression often stems not from intense trauma, but from purposeless comfort. The person has everything and feels nothing because no suffering they face seems connected to anything greater. Compare this. The athlete who suffers during brutal training doesn't develop trauma, they develop pride. Why? Because suffering has meaning. It's building something. The arsenal. Practical application. The resignification technique. Take your greatest trauma and complete this sentence. This suffering uniquely qualifies me for blank. Examples. Betrayal only qualifies me to help others recognize signs of deceit. Illness has uniquely qualified me to value each day of good health. Loss uniquely qualifies me to comfort others in deep mourning. Future purpose method. Identify a specific mission that requires you to have gone through what you've been through. Your suffering becomes a credential, not a scar.
Love transcends physical presence. Love goes far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in their spiritual being, in their inner self. In the camp, Frankl had a mystical revelation. Marching in the cold before dawn, exhausted and beaten, he began to converse mentally with his wife, unaware that she had already died in another camp. At that moment, he understood. Love does not depend on physical presence. The image of his beloved, the essence of who she was, radiated light upon his darkness. And that light was real as any physical force. This discovery destroys reductionist materialism. We are not just bodies. Our connections are not merely chemical. There is a spiritual dimension to reality where love persists beyond death, distance, and separation. Frankl describes lying in the shed, covered in lice, shivering with cold, when he saw the image of his wife with crystal clarity. She was smiling at him. And at that moment he understood the truth that mystics have always known. Man's salvation is through love and in love. Even after discovering she had died, the experience remained valid. The love he felt was real, and that love gave him the strength to go on when nothing else remained. We live in an age of superficial relationships. People measure love in likes, messages, and constant physical presence. When there is distance or loss, they collapse. But Frankl teaches us, if you have truly loved someone, that love remains as a living force within you. It doesn't matter if the person died, left, or betrayed you. The capacity for love that you developed is yours. It's a spiritual muscle that no one can atrophy except yourself. The arsenal, practical application. Meditation on inner presence. Set aside 10 minutes each day. Close your eyes. Invoke the image of someone you love, living or dead, present or absent. Feel their presence not as a memory, but as a real spiritual presence. Let that love strengthen you. The technique of transcendent gratitude. Instead of suffering from the absence, practice gratitude for having been able to love. I am someone whose capacity for love is so profound that even loss cannot destroy it.
The neuroses of existential unemployment. Existential frustration is neither pathological nor pathogenic in itself. A man's worry, even despair, about the dignity of his life is a spiritual anguish, but by no means a mental illness. Frankl revolutionized psychology by realizing that many modern mental illnesses are not illnesses at all. They are symptoms of existential emptiness. A person feels anxiety not because they have a chemical imbalance, but because they live a meaningless life. They feel boredom not because they are lazy, but because none of their actions seem to matter cosmically. This explains why wealthy societies have epidemics of depression. It's not a lack of resources, it's a lack of meaningful challenges. Human beings need something to strive for. Frankl described Sundays in the camp as the most dangerous days. There was no work. The prisoners were idle. And it was during these moments of rest that most men committed suicide. Why? Because during forced labor, however brutal, there was an immediate goal: to survive the day. On Sundays, they confronted the abyss. What for? What is the meaning of all this? Those who had an answer survived Sundays. Those who didn't often touched the electrified wire. Generation Z is facing record levels of anxiety and depression, not because they live harder lives than their grandparents. Objectively, they live much easier lives, but because they live less meaningful lives. There is no war to win. There are no frontiers to explore. There is no hunger to overcome. Only endless entertainment and existential emptiness. Frankl might say, Your anxiety is not an illness. It is your soul crying out for a purpose worthy of you. The arsenal. Practical application. Exercise of single responsibility. Identify a responsibility that only you can fulfill, not something you want to do, something the world needs you to do. It can be small, raising your child well, finishing a book, caring for a relative, but it must be something where you are irreplaceable. The technique of deserved suffering. Instead of avoiding discomfort, seek meaningful suffering. Choose a goal that is difficult enough to generate pain, but connected to a purpose. Athletes understand this. Business people understand this. Martyrs understand this. So far, we've laid the groundwork. You possess irrevocable inner freedom. Your suffering can have meaning. Love transcends the physical, and your emptiness can be a symptom of a healthy soul in an insane world. But now we enter deeper territory. The advanced tactics that Frankl developed not only to survive trauma, but to transcend it completely. What follows are practices that transform victims into witnesses, that convert scars into wisdom, that make the survivor a bearer of light for others who still walk in darkness. Get ready, because these laws require radical courage.
Paradoxical intention. Embrace fear. The paradoxical intention consists of wishing for precisely what one fears to happen. Frankl developed a revolutionary therapeutic technique. Instead of avoiding fear, he taught patients to embrace it intentionally. Are you afraid of sweating in public? Try to sweat as much as possible. Are you afraid of stuttering? Try to stutter deliberately. Are you afraid of having a panic attack? Try to induce the worst possible attack. What happens? Fear loses its power, because fear feeds on avoidance. When you turn around and face it, saying, "Come on, do your worst," it withers. This isn't toxic positivity. It's psychological warfare strategy. It's what Frankl practiced when he turned his suffering into an object of scientific observation. Frankl treated a patient who had suffered from severe stuttering since childhood. Every social situation was terrifying. Traditional techniques failed. Frankl instructed, when you meet someone, try to stutter as much as possible. Make it a game. See how much you can stutter. The patient tried and discovered something extraordinary. When he tried to stutter, he couldn't. The stuttering disappeared because it was maintained by anticipatory anxiety. Once the anxiety was removed through paradoxical intention, the symptom evaporated. Do you have social trauma, fear of rejection, performance anxiety? The modern approach is to protect yourself, create a safe space, and avoid triggers. Frankl would say, this strengthens the trauma. You are feeding the monster. Instead, intentionally expose yourself. Go into the situation you fear and try to make what you fear happen. Try to be rejected. Try to fail. Try to be humiliated. When you remove the power of fear through paradoxical confrontation, it collapses. The arsenal. Practical application. Paradoxical intention protocol. Identify your specific fear. Example, I'm afraid I'll tremble when speaking in public. Go into the feared situation with the intention of provoking the feared outcome. Tell yourself internally, I'm going to shake as much as possible. I'm going to make people notice. Watch the fear lose its power. Weekly challenge. Once a week, intentionally do something that generates mild anxiety. Start a conversation with a stranger. Ask a stupid question. Post a controversial opinion. Build psychological immunity. Reflection. Stop observing yourself. Hyperreflection, thinking too much about oneself, can lead to incapacity. The cure is dereflection, focusing outside of oneself. Frankl identified a deadly paradox. The more you try to control something, the harder it becomes. Why? Because these functions are autotelic. They work best when forgotten. Excessive conscious attention sabotages them. Consider sleep. You only fall asleep when you stop trying to sleep. The more you monitor, "Am I sleeping?" the more you wake up. Trauma creates hypervigilance. The person is constantly monitoring. "Am I experiencing anxiety? Is my heart racing? Am I okay?" This self-monitoring keeps the trauma alive. It's like constantly picking at a wound to see if it still hurts. Frankl treated a diplomat who developed sexual dysfunction after a critical comment from his wife. The more he tried to perform, the worse it got. He entered a vicious cycle of sexual hyperreflection. Frankl did not treat the sexual symptom, he treated hyperreflection. He taught men to focus completely on their partner, her pleasure, her reactions, her experience, totally forgetting about themselves. Result: function restored. Why? Because dereflection allows natural mechanisms to operate without conscious interference. Modern culture is obsessed with self-monitoring, therapy, journaling, constant self-analysis, body check, mood tracking. For some people this helps, but for many it perpetuates the problem. The person spends so much time analyzing their trauma that they never allow it to heal. They keep picking at the wound, processing, reliving, retelling. Frankl would say, there is a time for analysis, but there is also a time to forget, to focus on a greater purpose that transcends the self. External focus technique. When you feel anxiety rising, don't analyze it. Immediately shift your attention to a concrete external task. Describe your surroundings in detail. Count objects. Help someone. Force your attention outward. Practice of self-transcendence. Dedicate 2 hours a week to an activity where you completely forget about yourself. Art, volunteering, deep conversation, workflow. The more you transcend the self, the healthier the self becomes.
Tragic optimistic attitude. Tragic optimism. Remaining optimistic despite the tragic triad: pain, guilt, and death. This is Frankl's final synthesis. It is not naive optimism that denies suffering, nor is it nihilistic pessimism that succumbs to it. It is optimism that incorporates suffering as an essential component. Life includes inevitable pain. You will make mistakes. You will die. These are fixed conditions. The question is, will you protest against these conditions, become bitter, grow resentful? Or will you accept the conditions and build meaning within them? Pessimism says, since I'm going to suffer and die anyway, nothing else matters. Naive optimism says, if I think positively, I won't suffer. Tragic optimism says, I will suffer and die, and yet I will create something beautiful. Frankl himself is the ultimate case study. He lost everything: family, career, book manuscript, health, years of life. It could have emerged bitter, destructive, nihilistic. Many survivors did emerge that way, and who could blame them? Instead, she rebuilt her life. She rewrote her book. She remarried. She had a daughter. She taught around the world. She died at 92, having impacted millions. Not because he pretended the horror didn't happen, but because he chose to extract meaning from the horror. Modern culture lives between two toxic extremes. Toxic positivity. Just think positive, gratitude, manifestation. Denies the reality of suffering. Cult of trauma. I am my wounds. My trauma defines me. I need to process it eternally. Frankl offers a third way. Yes, I was hurt. Yes, it was horrible. And yet, I will use this experience to grow. The arsenal, practical application. Exercise of the tragic legacy. Complete these 3 sentences. The pain I experienced taught me. The mistake I made qualified me for. Knowing that I will die, I choose to live today.
Liability for victimization. Man is not a product of his environment. Man is a product of his decisions. This is perhaps Frankl's most uncomfortable law, and the most liberating. In the camps, there were prisoners who were SS, brutal guards, traitors, collaborators. And there were SS who secretly helped prisoners, risking their lives. The environment was the same. The circumstances were identical, but the choices were opposite. Frankl concludes, the environment influences but does not determine. Between stimulus and response, there is choice, and that choice is where our humanity resides. This destroys the victimhood narrative. My trauma made me this way. My past defines me. I can't change because of what they did to me. Frankl would say, you are traumatized, and yet you are responsible for how you respond to that trauma. Frankl describes 2 brothers who grew up with an abusive alcoholic father. One became an alcoholic as well. The other became a social worker, specializing in rehabilitation. When the alcoholic was asked why he drank, he said, with a father like mine, what did you expect? When the social worker was asked why he chose that career, he said, with a father like mine, what did you expect? Same past, opposite choices. We live in an era of victimhood identity. I have the diagnosis, therefore I cannot take responsibility. Frankl does not deny the reality of trauma, but he refuses to allow trauma to be an excuse for abdicating responsibility. Were you abused? Real, traumatic, unfair. And yet, you are responsible for healing yourself, for not passing on the abuse, for breaking the cycle. No one else can do this for you, and no one can use your past as an eternal crutch. The arsenal, practical application. Radical responsibility technique. For each complaint about your past, complete, yes, traumatic event, happened, and I am responsible for blank. Examples. Yes, I was betrayed, and I am responsible for restoring my ability to trust. Yes, I was abused, and I am responsible for not becoming an abuser. Yes, I failed, and I am responsible for learning from it and trying again.
Viktor Frankl entered Auschwitz as a promising psychiatrist with an incomplete theory. He emerged as one of the greatest psychologists in history, not despite the field, but because of the field. The countryside was not a pause in his life, it was the crucible where his masterpiece was forged. And that's the final lesson. There is no wasted trauma, only trauma that is not understood. Every wound you carry can be transformed into wisdom. Every dark night of the soul can become a portal to a brighter dawn. Every descent into hell qualifies you to guide others out of it. But this alchemy, this transmutation of lead into gold, demands something from you. It requires making meaningful choices about victimization. It requires you to accept responsibility for apologies. It demands that you embrace purpose more than personal comfort. Frankl spent 3 years in literal hate, and he emerged not with hatred, but with a message of hope. If he can do that, if he can transform Auschwitz into wisdom, then you can transform your trauma. Not because their suffering is less, but because the principle is the same. Between the trauma and your response to the trauma, there is a space. And in that space lies your freedom. Your humanity resides in that space. Your choice resides in this space. So choose. Will you be defined by what was done to you, or by what you did with what was done to you? The answer to that question determines not only how you survive, but who do you become.